The call came at 6:47 inches the morning. I remember because I had just made coffee 2 cups, out of habit, and I was standing at the kitchen window watching the sun come up over the backyard when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was the hospital. I already knew what they were going to say. Carol had been declining for 3 months, and the night before, when I left her room, she had held my hand a little longer than usual, like she was already saying goodbye. I drove to the hospital in silence. I didn't turn on the radio. I just watched the road and thought about the first morning I ever made her coffee, 1987, in a tiny apartment in Columbus, Ohio. When we were both so broke we shared a single coffee mug and laughed about it. 36 years of marriage. 36 years of 2 cups every single morning. She was 61 years old. Too young. Everyone said so at the funeral. Too young. Too soon. What a tragedy. People shook my hand and said the right things, and I nodded and thanked them, and inside I felt like someone had reached into my chest and removed something essential, something I hadn't even known was keeping me upright until it was gone. Our son Derek flew in from Atlanta 2 days before the service. He brought his wife, Stacy. I had always been cordial with Stacy. I couldn't say I knew her well, even after 7 years of marriage to my son. She was pleasant at holidays, organized, efficient, the kind of woman who always had a plan. I had just never realized whose benefit those plans were for. They stayed in the guest room. I told them they were welcome as long as they needed, because I meant it. The house felt enormous and empty with Carol gone, and having voices in the hallway, even unfamiliar voices, was better than the silence. The funeral was on a Thursday. Carol had wanted lilies and no black clothes, so I wore the dark green sweater she had given me 2 Christmases ago, and I held it together until the pastor mentioned her laugh. Then I didn't hold it together anymore. I'm not ashamed of that. Afterward, people came back to the house. Derek moved through the rooms like a host, refilling glasses, directing people to the food trays Stacy had organized. I sat in my armchair by the fireplace and let people come to me. At one point, I looked across the room and caught Stacy standing in the doorway of my bedroom, Carol's and mine, just standing there looking in. Not doing anything, not saying anything, just looking. I told myself it didn't mean anything. That was my first mistake. The following week, Derek and Stacy announced they weren't going back to Atlanta yet. Derek said he wanted to make sure I was okay, that he didn't feel right leaving me alone so soon. I told him I appreciated it, that I was fine, that they didn't need to put their lives on hold. He waved me off, said it was no trouble. Stacy smiled and said, of course they were staying. Family takes care of family. I believed him. That was my second mistake. It started small, the way these things always do. Stacy began reorganizing the kitchen. She said she was trying to help, make things easier for me. And I let it go because I didn't have the energy to argue and because, honestly, grief does something to your instinct for self-preservation. You become slow. You let things slide that you would never have let slide before, because every ounce of attention you have is focused on just getting through the day. She moved Carol's recipe box off the counter, said it was taking up space. I found it in a drawer behind the utility bills. I put it back on the counter and didn't say anything. Then one morning, about 10 days after the funeral, I came downstairs to find Derek sitting at my desk in the study with my laptop open. I stopped in the doorway. He looked up, not particularly startled, and said he needed to print something and hoped I didn't mind. I did mind, but I said it was fine. That afternoon, Stacy asked if they could move into the master bedroom. She framed it carefully, said the guest room mattress was hurting her back, said they were going to be there for a while, several weeks at least, and they needed a proper space to work, because they both worked remotely and the guest room was too small for 2 desks. She said it in a tone that suggested this was a perfectly reasonable request, the kind of thing any sensible person would agree to immediately. I looked at her for a long moment. Then I looked at Derek, who was standing behind her with his hands in his pockets, looking at the floor. That's mine, and your mother's room, I said. Stacy said she understood that. Of course she did, and she was so sorry. But practically speaking, it just made more sense. She said I could take the guest room. It was only temporary, after all. I want to be honest about what happened next, because I've thought about it many times since. I didn't have a grand plan at that point. I wasn't playing chess. I was 63 years old, and I had buried my wife 8 days earlier, and I was tired in a way I had never been tired before. So I said I would think about it, and I went out to the backyard and sat on the porch swing that Carol and I had bought at an estate sale in 2019, and I stared at the garden she had planted along the fence line, and I thought about how strange it is that the people who are supposed to love you can show you exactly who they are at the very moment you are least equipped to deal with it. I slept in the guest room that night. I told myself it was temporary. It wasn't, of course. It never is, once you give an inch to people like Stacy. Within 2 weeks, they had settled into my bedroom like they had always lived there. Stacy bought new throw pillows, had them delivered to the house, my house, and I said nothing. Derek set up a second monitor on the dresser where Carol had kept her jewelry box. The jewelry box was in a plastic bin in the closet. I moved it to my nightstand in the guest room. I want to tell you I confronted them. I want to tell you I stood up and drew a line. But grief is a strange companion. And for those first weeks, it sat on my chest like a stone and made everything feel distant and muffled, like I was watching my own life through a fogged-up window. I kept thinking, this is temporary. They'll go back to Atlanta. This will pass. Then, Stacy started making calls. I didn't know it at first. Derek mentioned it casually one evening that Stacy had been looking into some options, making sure I was taken care of. He said it like it was something kind. I asked what he meant. He got vague. Said just exploring. Nothing definite. Just keeping all possibilities open. 3 days later, a man in a gray blazer rang the front doorbell. He handed me a business card. Real estate. He said he had spoken with Stacy, and she had asked him to come by and take a look at the property. I asked him to leave. That evening, I told Derek what had happened. I said, clearly, that the house was mine, that it was not for sale, and that I needed him to explain that to his wife. Derek nodded. He looked uncomfortable. He said, "Of course, Dad. Absolutely. I'll talk to her." Stacy came to find me an hour later. She sat down across from me at the kitchen table with the patient, careful expression of someone who has rehearsed what they're about to say. She talked about practicality, about how a house this size was a lot for one person to maintain, about property taxes and upkeep costs and how the market was excellent right now, historically excellent, and how it would be a shame not to take advantage of that. She talked about senior living communities, said she'd looked into a few lovely ones nearby, very active, lots of amenities. She said it like she was doing me a favor. I let her finish. Then I said, "Stacy, this is my home. Carol and I built our life here. I am not selling it, and I am not moving into a senior living community. I'm 63 years old." She smiled. It didn't reach her eyes. She said she understood, of course, and she was just trying to think about what was best for me. Then she got up and left the room. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in the guest room, in my house, and stared at the ceiling. And for the first time since Carol died, I felt something other than grief. I felt something sharper, something that woke me up. I started paying attention. What I noticed, once I was paying attention, was that Derek deferred to Stacy in everything. Not the way a husband defers to a wife in small matters, whose turn it is to cook, which movie to watch. The way a person defers to someone they are slightly afraid of. He watched her when she spoke. He checked her expression before he responded to me. He had always been an easygoing kid. Derek too easygoing. Maybe, in a way Carol and I had sometimes worried about. But I had never seen it this clearly before. Stacy was the engine. Derek was the vehicle. I also noticed that Stacy had been going through things. Not obviously, not in a way I could confront directly. But small things moved. Drawers that I knew I had left closed were slightly open. The filing cabinet in the study, where I kept insurance documents and financial records, had been gone through, I knew, because I had placed a single paperclip on top of a specific folder, an old habit from my years working in contracts, and the paperclip was gone. She was looking for something. I knew exactly what she was looking for, and I knew she wasn't going to find it in that filing cabinet. Here is something I haven't told many people. About 2 years before she died, Carol came to me and said she wanted to talk about money. Not our joint accounts, not the house she had been thinking about something separate. She had come into a small inheritance when her aunt passed, about $40,000, and she wanted to do something with it independently. She had been reading about investing, listening to podcasts, doing research the way Carol always did things thoroughly, quietly, without any fanfare. She said she wanted to open a brokerage account in her own name. She said she wanted to build something that was just hers, that she'd built herself. I thought it was a wonderful idea. I told her so. Over the following 2 years, through a combination of smart choices and genuine good luck with timing, that $40,000 had grown considerably. Carol managed it herself, moved money around, reinvested dividends. She had a gift for it that surprised both of us. We talked about it sometimes in the evenings. She'd show me what she was doing, explain her reasoning, and I'd listen with genuine admiration. It became her project, her quiet pride. When she knew she was sick and the prognosis wasn't good, she sat down with our attorney, a man named Robert Fielding, who had handled our affairs for 15 years, and she updated everything. The brokerage account transferred to me directly upon her death, outside of probate, clean and simple. There was also the cabin. Carol had found it on a trip we took to East Tennessee 4 years ago, a lake property, about an hour outside Knoxville. Modest, beautiful, sitting on the edge of a cove with a dock and a screened porch, and a view that made you feel like the world had gotten things right at least once. We bought it on impulse, which was unlike both of us, but some things you just know. We put it in my name alone for tax reasons, on the advice of our accountant. We had planned to spend more time there once I fully retired. We never quite got around to it. Stacy didn't know about either of these things. Derek didn't either. We had never discussed them at family gatherings or holiday dinners. They weren't secrets exactly, they were simply ours. Private. The way a marriage contains 1,000 things that belong only to the two people inside it. And I had decided, just somewhere around the 3rd week of lying awake in my own guest room, that I was going to keep it that way for a while longer. The real estate agent came back. Stacy had apparently called him again, invited him for what she described to me as just an informal conversation. No pressure, just information. I sat through it with my hands folded on the kitchen table and listened to him tell me what the house was worth. It was worth quite a lot, as it turned out. The market in our neighborhood had been strong for years. When he finished, I asked him a question. I asked him whose signature would be required to authorize a sale. He glanced at Stacy, then back at me. He said the owner's signature, of course. I said, and who owns this house? He looked at his paperwork. He said my name. I said, just mine? Only mine? He said, yes, just mine. The title was in my name alone. I thanked him for his time and showed him to the door. Stacy was very quiet at dinner that evening. 2 days later, she came to me with a new approach. She said she had been thinking and she wanted to apologize for making me feel pressured. She said she cared about me and only wanted what was best. She said she and Derek had been talking, and they thought it might make sense for me too. And here she paused, chose her words to update my estate planning. Given everything that had happened, given that Carol was gone and circumstances had changed, she suggested I speak with an attorney. She mentioned she had actually already identified one, not Robert Fielding, a different one, a younger man she'd found through a referral she declined to specify. She said this new attorney was very experienced in estate matters and could help me think through my options. I looked at my son while she said all of this. He looked at the table. I said I was happy with my current attorney, who had handled our affairs for 15 years and whom I trusted completely. Stacy smiled her thin smile and said, of course, whatever I was comfortable with. That night I called Robert Fielding. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I had always appreciated about him. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Harold, you're not in any legal danger here. The house is yours. The brokerage account is yours. The cabin is yours. No one can take any of it from you without your consent. He paused. The question is whether you want to address this directly or let it play out. I said I wasn't sure yet. He said he understood. He said to call him whenever I was ready. I want to tell you about a Tuesday in October, about 6 weeks after Carol's funeral. because that was the day things shifted permanently. I had driven to the cemetery that morning. I went every week, usually early, before the day got busy. I brought lilies when I could find them. I sat on the bench near her headstone and talked to her. I'm not embarrassed about that either. I told her about the garden, which I'd been keeping up. I told her that the rose bush on the east fence had a late bloom coming in, orange-red, the color she'd always loved. I told her I missed her every day, every hour, in ways that were getting slightly more bearable and slightly more specific at the same time. Missing the exact sound of her voice saying my name, the particular way she folded dish towels, the way she laughed when something surprised her. I told her about Derek and Stacy. I said I thought I knew what to do, but I wanted to make sure I wasn't being unfair. I said, "Carol, you always saw people more clearly than I did. Tell me if I'm wrong about this." The wind moved through the trees around the cemetery and a few leaves came down, and I took that as her answer. When I got home, Stacy was on the phone in the kitchen. She didn't hear me come in. I was in the hallway when I heard her say a name, not Derek's name, not a friend's name. A name I recognized as belonging to a financial advisor in Atlanta who had apparently been helping Stacy and Derek plan what to do with a significant sum of money. Money that didn't exist yet. Money they were planning to receive. She was talking about timelines. She was talking about what they'd do once the house sold. She mentioned a number, not a small number. She was talking about it with the easy confidence of someone who considers a thing already done. I went to the backyard and sat on the porch swing. I thought about my son at 12 years old. The summer we drove across the country, and he sat in the back seat, reading every historical marker along the highway, and got genuinely excited about every single one. I thought about how much Carol had loved him, how proud she was, what a good heart he'd had as a boy. I thought about the person standing in my kitchen planning to sell my house out from under me while I was at his mother's grave. I felt the full weight of it then. I let myself feel it, all at once, instead of keeping it at arm's length the way I had been doing. And then I picked up my phone and called Robert Fielding again. I said, "I'm ready." What happened next was not dramatic. There were no shouting matches, no confrontations in the driveway. That's not the way I operate, and, more importantly, it wasn't necessary. The law was entirely on my side, and the law doesn't need to raise its voice. Robert sent a formal letter to Derek and Stacy. It stated clearly that the property at our home address was owned solely by me, that I had no intention of selling, and that, as the sole owner, I was now respectfully requesting that they make arrangements to vacate the property within 30 days. The letter also noted, without elaboration, that any future discussions about my estate, my assets, or my financial planning should be directed to Robert's office and not conducted informally, or through third-party attorneys. The 30 days were the longest of my life since the funeral. Stacy's response was immediate and, I'll admit, more intense than even I had anticipated. She came to find me within an hour of receiving the letter. Her face was very controlled, but her hands were not. She said I was being cruel. She said she and Derek had put their lives on hold to take care of me, had sacrificed, and this was how I repaid them. She said I would regret this. She said, and I remember this very clearly, "You're going to die alone in this house, Harold, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself." I said, "I appreciate your concern, Stacy. Please have your bags out by the 30th. Derek came to me that evening. He looked younger than he had in weeks, less certain, less polished. He sat down across from me and looked at his hands for a long time before he spoke. He said he was sorry. He said things had gotten out of hand. He said Stacy had been dealing with some financial pressure in Atlanta that he hadn't fully disclosed to me, and that he thought he stopped. He said he didn't have a good excuse. I said, "Derek, did you know she was planning to sell this house?" He didn't answer right away. That was my answer. I said, "Your mother is 3 months gone. This is the home she lived in for 28 years. He said he knew. He said he was ashamed. I said, "I love you. You're my son, and I love you, and that is not going to change. But what happened here? I need you to understand what happened here. Not for me, for you." He nodded. His eyes were wet. I looked at him and felt the full, complicated grief of it. Loving someone and being hurt by them, and knowing those two things can exist at the same time without canceling each other out. They left on a Thursday morning. Stacy went to the car first and didn't say goodbye. Derek hugged me in the doorway, and it was a real hug, the kind that acknowledges something. I held on for a moment and thought about the boy he had been. After they drove away, I stood in the quiet of my house for a long time. Then I made coffee. 2 cups. I carried one out to the porch swing and held the other in my hand and let it warm my fingers, and I looked at Carol's garden, and I said out loud, to nobody and to her, what now turned out to be this. In November, I drove down to Tennessee. The cabin had been sitting empty for almost a year, and it needed some attention, a repair on the dock, some work on the screened porch, a general cleaning out and freshening up. I spent a week there by myself, working in the mornings, sitting on the dock in the afternoons, eating simple meals, and going to bed early. I cannot tell you exactly what happened to me that week, except that something loosened. Some knot that had been tightening in my chest since Carol died began, slowly, to ease. Not because the grief was less, it wasn't, but because I was doing something. I was taking care of something that was mine. The view from that dock at sunrise was everything Carol had said it was. I understood why she'd wanted to come back here. I understood why she'd made sure I'd have a place to land. I called my daughter. I should tell you about my daughter, Ellen, who is 38 and lives in Portland, and who had flown in for the funeral, and who had called me every 3 days since. Ellen is nothing like Derek in the ways that matter for this story. Ellen had known within 24 hours of meeting Stacy exactly what kind of person she was. She'd told me so years ago, and I'd said she was being uncharitable. I owe her an apology for that. I called her from the dock and told her everything. She was quiet through most of it, the way she gets when she's angry but doesn't want to direct the anger at me. When I finished, she said, "Dad, I want to come see the cabin." I said, "Come whenever you want. It's yours too." She flew in at Thanksgiving. We spent 4 days there. She brought her partner, a good man named Marcus, who is genuinely handy and who fixed 3 things around the property before I'd even unpacked the groceries. We cooked too much food and ate on the porch in the cold and told Carol stories until we were laughing and crying in equal measure. Ellen found a photo in one of the drawers, Carol at the dock when we'd first bought the place, squinting into the sun with a big, ridiculous straw hat on, laughing at something I'd apparently said. Ellen had it framed and hung it in the living room. I didn't tell them about the brokerage account that Thanksgiving. I was still figuring out what I wanted to do with it, what Carol would have wanted. She hadn't left instructions beyond transferring it to me, which was itself an instruction of a kind of trust. You'll know what to do with it. By January, I had some clarity. I kept a portion, a comfortable portion, enough to not have to think about money again in a way that ever made me anxious. I was practical about it. Spoke with a financial advisor I found through Robert Fielding, put a plan in place. The rest, I directed into 3 places. A scholarship fund at the university where Carol had gotten her nursing degree, a donation to the hospital where she'd worked for 12 years, and a small endowment for the community garden 2 blocks from our house, the one she'd volunteered at every summer. I put her name on all 3. It wasn't about the grand gesture. It was about the fact that she had built those resources herself, quietly, out of her own intelligence and patience and care. And it felt right that they should go on doing what she had done quietly, patiently, taking care of people she'd never meet. Now, in the spring, the garden along the back fence is starting to come in again. I've been learning which plants are which, using the little labeled stakes Carol put in years ago, following her handwritten notes in the old garden journal I found in the garage. I'm not as good at it as she was, but I'm learning. Derek and I have spoken twice since October. It's careful, both times polite, a little formal, like 2 people who understand that trust has to be rebuilt from the ground up and are willing to start laying the first stones, but know it will take time. The second conversation was better than the first. He asked about the cabin. I told him about it, the lake, the dock, the way the light hits the water in the early morning. He was quiet for a moment and said it sounded like Mom. I said it was. I didn't mention Stacy. Neither did he. What I want to say, and I'm going to say it plainly, the way Carol always told me I should speak when I had something to say, is that there is a particular kind of loss that comes with discovering that someone you love is capable of something you didn't think they were. It's different from ordinary loss. Ordinary loss is clean, even when it's devastating. This other kind is tangled. You grieve the person who died, and you grieve the person who revealed themselves, and sometimes you're not sure which grief you're in. I thought about that a lot in those early months. About how Stacy had been exactly who she was the whole time, and I simply hadn't looked closely enough. About how Derek had let it happen, and what that meant, and what it would take to mean something different going forward. About how grief makes you vulnerable in ways that certain people are very willing to exploit, and how that is a fact of the world, and how knowing it doesn't make it any less painful. But here is what I also know. Carol knew. She knew not about this specific situation, because she couldn't have predicted this, but she knew, in the way she knew most things, that I would need a place to land. She knew I might need resources I wasn't expecting to need. She'd been planning for 36 years of eventualities, packing emergency kits, and keeping the gas tank above half, and putting $20 into a sock drawer every birthday, because you never know. She had loved me in the most practical, consistent, unglamorous way imaginable, and she had left me, along with her name on a scholarship and her handwriting in a garden journal and her ridiculous straw hat in a cabin in Tennessee, enough of a foundation to stand on. I stood on it. I'm still standing. Some mornings I still make 2 cups of coffee. I carry one out to the porch and hold the other, and I watch the light come up over the back fence, and I talk to her a little. I tell her about the garden. I tell her that the rose bush is coming in strong again, orange-red, just like she wanted. I tell her that Ellen came back last month with Marcus, and we stayed at the cabin for a long weekend, and she's talking about making it a regular thing. I tell her I'm okay. I tell her I kept quiet exactly long enough, and then I stopped being quiet, and it turned out that was the right order of things. I tell her I missed her yesterday, and I'll miss her tomorrow, and every day in between, and that none of that is something I need to fix or solve or recover from. It's just the shape of things now, the shape of loving someone for 36 years and then continuing to love them after. Some mornings the wind moves through the garden and a few petals come down from the rose bush, and I take that as her answer. I think she's telling me I did all right. I think she's telling me she's glad I kept quiet too. If you're watching this and you're in a situation like mine, if grief has made you slow and someone in your life is taking advantage of that slowness, I want you to hear this clearly. The house is yours. Whatever your Carol left you, whatever you built together, whatever is legally and rightfully yours, it belongs to you. Grief is not a weakness someone else has the right to exploit. Your loss does not create an obligation to people who only show up for what they can take. Find your Robert Fielding. Make your calls. Know what you own. And if you need to be quiet for a while, quiet about what you know, quiet about what you have, quiet about what you're planning, then be quiet. Wait for the right moment, and then stop being quiet. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of something you've been through or something you're going through right now, please leave a comment below. I read every one of them. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it with them. You never know who's sitting in a guest room in their own house, wondering if they have the right to take it back. They do. You do. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories like this one. I'll be right here.